have a female appears to be in distress. Running down the street, she's in handcuffs. There's a naked girl running down the street. She's got handcuffs on. She's screaming for help.
He said he was going to take me out to his cabin and let me go, but I knew he was going to kill me.
The mild-mannered baker seemed like the last person anyone would suspect of being Alaska's most prolific serial killer. What we discovered was that Robert Hansen wasn't just killing these women, he was hunting them like animals. Welcome back to Crimeco, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning. Until well after the case ends today, we're taking you to the last frontier, Alaska, where beneath the pristine wilderness and endless daylight one man turned the American dream into an absolute nightmare. For over a decade, beginning in 1972, Robert Hansen stalked the streets of Anchorage, Alaska, where he kidnapped, assaulted, and then killed at least 17 women. But this wasn't just about murder. This was about the hunt. Hansen abducted, raped, and murdered at least 17 women, many of whom he released into the wilderness to hunt with firearms and knives. A successful businessman by day, predator by night, in a case that would redefine our understanding of serial killing in America. Hold on tight while we unravel the chilling true story of the butcher baker from A to Z. By all outward appearances, Robert Christian Hansen was living the American dream in Anchorage, Alaska. The unassuming Anchorage native was married with children and a successful businessman. He owned Hansen's Bakery, a popular spot where locals would stop by for fresh pastries and friendly conversation. Customers knew him as a soft-spoken, hard-working family man who built his business from nothing. But Robert Hansen had been perfecting a very different kind of skill for decades, the art of the hunt. Born February 15th, 1939, in Iowa, Hansen's childhood was marked by brutal bullying and social isolation. Severe acne scarred his face, and a pronounced stutter made him a target for relentless teasing while other kids were making friends. Hansen was developing an obsession with hunting and tracking skills that would serve him well in Alaska's vast wilderness. In 1967, Hansen moved his family to Anchorage, drawn by Alaska's frontier spirit and endless hunting opportunities. He opened his bakery and seemed to settle into the role of respected businessman, but something was simmering beneath that mild-mannered exterior. Alaska Inn. The 1970s was a rough place. The pipeline was bringing in thousands of transient workers, and Anchorage's red light district was thriving for over a decade. Beginning in 1973, Robert Hansen stalked the streets of Anchorage, Alaska. But he wasn't just picking random victims. Hansen was methodically targeting women. He believed no one would miss dancers, sex workers, and women living on society's margins. What made Hansen different from other serial killers was his method. This wasn't crimes of passion or opportunity. This was calculated, systematic, and absolutely terrifying. Hansen's routine was as chilling as it was precise. He would cruise the streets of downtown Anchorage, usually late at night, looking for vulnerable women. He'd offer them money, drugs, or simply a ride to safety. But once they got in his car, their nightmare was just beginning. Hansen would drive his victims to his home on Old Harbor Road, where he had converted his basement into what can only be described as a torture chamber. There, he would systematically assault his victims while they were chained and helpless. But for Hansen, this was just the beginning. The truly horrifying part came next. Hansen would load his victims into his Piper Super Cub aircraft. He was an experienced pilot and fly them to remote locations in the Alaskan wilderness. Once there, he would give them what seemed like a chance at freedom run. He would tell them then he would hunt them down with a rifle, tracking them through the wilderness like the big game he'd been hunting since childhood. Once he had control over each target, Hansen took his victims in his private plane to remote areas in the Alaskan wilderness to hunt them down with a rifle. For Hansen, this was the ultimate hunt, the most dangerous game. These weren't animals, they were human beings who could think, strategize, and feel terror. And that's exactly what excited him. Some victims he kept alive for days, releasing them multiple times only to recapture them when they thought they'd escaped. Others weren't so lucky, they were killed immediately after the assault at his home, but all of them suffered unimaginable horror at the hands of Alaska's most dangerous predator. What made Hansen's crimes possible was the environment he operated in. Hansen was convicted in 1984 after confessing to killing 17 women, mostly dancers and prostitutes. During a 12-year span, these were women society had largely written off. Some had criminal records, drug problems, or worked. In the sex industry, when they disappeared, there were few people asking questions, and even fewer with the power to demand answers. Police reports from the time show that many of Hansen's victims were initially classified as runaways or women who had simply left town. Alaska's transient population made it easy for people to disappear without raising immediate red flags, and Hansen was counting on that, but some people were paying attention. Family members who knew their daughters, sisters, and mothers wouldn't just vanish. Social workers who noticed patterns, social workers who noticed patterns, social workers who noticed patterns. And eventually law enforcement officers who began to see connections that couldn't be ignored. Bodies started turning up in remote areas of Alaska, some shot, others stabbed, many showing signs of prolonged torture. The locations were so remote that some victims weren't discovered for months or even years, and when they were found, they were often too decomposed to provide much forensic evidence. What investigators did notice was that many of the victims had been found near popular hunting areas, places where someone with extensive knowledge of Alaska would feel comfortable operating. The killer wasn't just familiar with these areas, he was an expert. On June 13, 1983, Cindy Polson was kidnapped and raped, her life threatened by Robert Hansen. Her eventual getaway was central to Hansen's ultimate capture. In confession to the murder of dozens of women, 17-year-old Cindy Polson was working the streets of Anchorage when she encountered Robert Hansen like so. Many before her, she got into his car thinking this was just another client, but Hansen had other plans. He drove Cindy to his home where he chained her in his basement torture chamber. Robert Hansen then took Cindy Polson to his home, sexually assaulted and tortured her for hours in addition to the handcuffs he kept on her wrists. Hansen also tied a rope around her neck and tied it to a coffee table in his house. For hours, Cindy endured unthinkable abuse while Hansen prepared for what he considered the main event, taking her into the wilderness for his twisted hunting game. But Hansen made a crucial mistake he underestimated Cindy Polson. When Hansen loaded Cindy into his car to drive to the airport where his plane was waiting, she knew this was likely her last chance as Hansen was distracted loading equipment into his aircraft. Cindy made her move after being raped and tortured in the basement of Hansen's home. Teen sex worker Cindy Polson made a run for it at the airport while her captor was busy loading his plane.
My gosh, she is running naked and in handcuffs on the streets of Anchorage, scared to death.
Rothschild recalled of the scene. Picture this scene. A teenage girl, naked, handcuffed, running desperately through the streets of Anchorage in broad daylight, screaming for help. It was a scene so shocking that multiple people called 911 and police responded immediately. But when officers found Cindy, her story seemed almost impossible to believe. She told them about a baker who had tortured her and planned to hunt her in the wilderness. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, not real life in Anchorage, Alaska. Initially, some officers were skeptical. Cindy was a teenage prostitute with a criminal record, and her story involved a respected businessman but detective. Glenn Flo saw something in Cindy's eyes that convinced him she was telling the truth. Raw, genuine terror flood began investigating Robert Hansen, and what he found was disturbing. Hansen had been arrested multiple times over the years for minor crimes against women, exposing himself, propositioning undercover officers, and making unwanted advances. Each incident was relatively minor on its own, but together they painted a picture of escalating behavior. More importantly, Hansen fit the profile investigators had been developing for the unknown killer. He was an experienced hunter and pilot with extensive knowledge of Alaska's Wilderness. He had access to the remote areas where bodies had been found, and he had a history of targeting vulnerable women. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed proof. The breakthrough came when investigators searched Hansen's home and found what could only be described as trophies, jewelry belonging to missing women, personal items that victims' families identified as belonging to their loved ones, and most damning of all, detailed maps marking locations in the wilderness locations that corresponded almost exactly to where bodies had been found. Hansen had been keeping meticulous records of his crimes, marking his hunting grounds like a big game hunter marking successful kills. It was the organized behavior of a serial killer who thought he was untouchable, faced with overwhelming evidence. Hansen initially tried to maintain his innocence, but as investigators pressed him with more details, the jewelry, the maps, the eyewitness testimony from Cindy, Pulse and his story began to crumble. Finally, on February 22, 1984, Robert Hansen broke down and confessed, but this wasn't just a simple admission of guilt. Hansen provided investigators with details that only the killer could know: where bodies were buried, how victims had been killed, and most chillingly, which ones had been released into the wilderness for his hunting game. Hansen was convicted in 1984 after confessing to killing 17 women, mostly dancers and prostitutes. During a 12-year span, Hansen was convicted of just 4 of the murders in a deal that spared him having to go to trial 17 times. The Anchorage baker also confessed to raping another 30 women after his arrest in 1983. Hansen faced overwhelming evidence, so he pleaded guilty, but only to 4 murders. In order to avoid 17 different trials, part of his plea deal was to lead investigators to the bodies they had not yet found. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Hansen agreed to lead authorities to the locations of victims who hadn't been found yet. Over several weeks, he guided investigators to remote locations across Alaska, pointing out graves and dump sites with the casual indifference of someone giving directions to a grocery store. What emerged was a picture of systematic, calculated evil that had operated in plain sight. For over a decade, Hansen hadn't just been killing these women, he had been perfecting his method, refining his hunting technique, in human beings like big game trophies. While Hansen confessed to 17 murders, investigators believed the true number of victims was much higher. After his arrest, Hansen confessed to 17 brutal murders. Though authorities suspect there were more than 30 victims, Alaska's vast wilderness made it impossible to recover all the evidence, and Hansen himself seemed to lose track of exactly how many women he had killed. What we do know is that Hansen's victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 30s. They came from different backgrounds but shared one tragic commonality: they were all vulnerable women who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. Some of Hansen's confirmed victims include Keelia Van Zanten, 18, who disappeared in 1971 while walking to a supermarket; Sherry Marraro, 23, found shot to death in a shallow grave; Paula Gulen, 30, found buried in a remote location; Joanna Messina, 24, discovered near Seward Highway. Each woman had her own story, her own dreams, her own story, her own dreams, her own people who loved her. But to Hansen, they were nothing more than prey. Even today, decades after Hansen's capture, investigators continued to work cold cases that might be connected to him. The victim was identified Friday as Robin Pelkey, who was 19 when she was killed by Robert Hansen in the early 1980s. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Investigation Unit said, showing that new victims are still being identified through advances in DNA technology. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, plus life sentences for the murders he would never again see. The Alaska wilderness where he had committed his crimes, never again have the opportunity to hurt another human being. Hansen was convicted in 1984 after confessing to killing 17 women, but he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Robert Christian Bose Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker, was an American serial killer who died in prison in 2014, taking whatever remaining secrets he had to his grave. Cindy Paulson, the brave young woman whose escape led to Hansen's capture, tried to rebuild her life after the trial. The film The Frozen Ground brought Cindy Polson's story to a wider audience, depicting her abduction and escape, as well as the investigation that led to Robert Hansen's capture, her courage in facing down her attacker in court helped ensure that Hansen would never hurt anyone again. The case changed how law enforcement approached missing persons cases involving marginalized communities. It highlighted the dangers of dismissing victims based on their circumstances and showed the importance of taking all reports seriously, regardless of who was making them. For the families of Hansen's victims, his capture brought some measure of closure, but the pain of their losses remained. Many had spent years not knowing what happened to their loved ones, and learning the truth was both a relief and a fresh source of anguish. What makes the Robert Hansen case so particularly chilling is how ordinary he seemed. This wasn't obviously disturbed individual living on the margins of society. This was a successful businessman, a family man, someone who contributed to his community and seemed to embody American values. By day, Hansen was baking bread and serving customers with a smile by night. He was planning and executing some of the most horrific crimes in Alaska's history. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions is a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades. Hansen's case also highlighted the vulnerabilities in society, how certain groups of people can become invisible, how their disappearances can be overlooked or dismissed as victims weren't chosen randomly. They were specifically selected because Hansen believed no one would look for them or care if they disappeared, but people did care. Families never stopped searching. Investigators never stopped searching. Investigators never stopped working. And ultimately, one brave teenager's escape brought down a monster who thought he was untouchable. The Alaska wilderness that Hansen used as his hunting ground remains as beautiful and vast as ever. But for those who know its history, those remote locations will always carry the memory of the women who lost their lives there, and the evil that once stalked through the last frontier. Today, Robert Hansen's name is synonymous with some of the most calculating and cruel crimes in American history. His case has been the subject of books, documentaries, and films, each trying to understand how someone could commit such acts while maintaining the appearance of normally. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Hansen case is the changes it brought to how missing persons cases are handled. Law enforcement agencies now better understand the importance cases are handled. Law enforcement agencies now better understand the importance of looking for patterns, taking all victims seriously regardless of their circumstances, and maintaining detailed databases that can help identify serial offenders. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of listening to survivors. Cindy Polson's testimony was crucial to Hansen's conviction, but it took courage for investigators to believe her story and pursue it despite skepticism from others. In the end, Robert Hansen's reign of terror lasted over a decade, but it was ultimately stopped by the bravery of one teenage girl who refused to become another victim. Her escape not only saved her own life, but prevented countless other women from suffering the same fate. The butcher baker is gone, but the lessons from his crimes remain. Evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, but it can also be stopped by ordinary people with extraordinary courage. What do you think about the Hansen case? How did someone manage to hide such horrific crimes while maintaining a normal public life for so long? And what does this case teach us about protecting society's most vulnerable members? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into one of Alaska's most notorious cases compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to Crimeco. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the cases that shock, puzzle, and ultimately teach us about the darkest corners of human nature. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding in plain sight.